In terms of who takes your work and applies it, I'm thinking instantly around education and the stage at which they may intervene to help a child. Are you doing studies to look at what point is it optimal to do the intervention so that the outcome isn't predetermined?
Yeah, well, the answer is no, I'm not. People are. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of studies around, things like autism and dyslexia. But I think one of the sort of general points is just recognizing the diversity of many different aspects, the way we think, the way we feel, the way we experience things, our personality traits, even the way that we perceive the world, actually. There's a lot of variation in that goes unnoticed and underappreciated. So within education, it's absolutely crucial, and of course it comes down to resources and time and a teacher being able to notice one particular student versus another. And thankfully, it differs across countries, but here, I guess, as well as in Ireland, there's a lot more resources and recognition for things like autism and dyslexia and so on. So, there's a lot of research there. I'm not doing it personally, but it is being done, yeah.
I just want to, you're talking about the intervention, and I feel there's not enough about prevention of mental health, I looked into my family tree because I was wondering, why did I have this anxiety and eating disorder? And actually there was an awful lot, like you said, genetics. My sisters had it on my mom's side, a lot of insomnia. And I looked at it, and actually my mom's dad, and I've nothing against him, my mom's dad was 65 having mom, and his parents were very old having her. And you were talking about mutations.
Yeah.
And older in Ireland, they had to kind of marry into families, do you know what I mean, to get, they had to have money to marry in farms, and so there was a lot of old people getting married and having children, and you talk about the mutations, and I don't feel there's enough about preventing, I do believe that, I really believe that having children earlier is better than...
Yeah, so it's an interesting, it opens a kind of can of worms when you talk about prevention, but actually, well, there's two ways you can think about it. First of all, you raise the point of where the mutations come from. And so mutations happen every time DNA is copied, basically. And because, actually, particularly in men, because our... The cells that make sperm continue developing throughout our lifetime and continue dividing, they actually accumulate mutations, which means that older fathers pass on more mutations than younger ones.
There's not enough talk about this.
Well, yeah.
And then you're left with the children,
Yes.
and sometimes the anxiety and insomnia comes later on in life.
Yes.
It doesn't come necessarily, because they say, oh, the child is perfect, but let's wait.
Well, so it is true that older fathers have... so say the risk of the child having autism, for example, is about 5 times greater if the father's over 50 compared to under 25. So it is an important potential source of mutation. Yeah. Now, what society chooses to do about that, I don't know. But I will say, actually, that
just
a lot of...
my family tree, and I just saw so many.
Yes.
And I just was wondering why I'm different to my friends.
So I think a more general point that will come up, that we have yet to deal with and grapple with the ethical implications of, is genetic screening. So as we're learning more and more, we're identifying more and more of the mutations that cause things like autism or epilepsy or depression or schizophrenia and so on. We have the tools now to screen for those in say, pre-implantation screening in vitro fertilization. And that's already done. So when people are doing IVF, they already screen for genetic conditions generally. And of course, Down syndrome and other developmental conditions like that are screened for normally. So what is happening is that we're accumulating more and more knowledge about those conditions. Our ability to screen for those is increasing all the time. And now the question is, what do we do with that knowledge? And in some places in the world, it's regulated very differently from other places. In the UK, there's a list of genetic conditions that you can screen for in IVF. And if it's not on the list, then it's not permissible to screen for it. But that list grows all the time as we learn more and more mutations. So the question of what you do with that and the ethical implications of that power are really interesting. And I think what's going to happen is that the genetic information, it's already happening actually, is outstripping our ethical grounding of what should be permissible.
In the example of the identical twins, how does development variations occur? And is it only because of these development variations that these same identical twins have different reactions in same situations?
So the first question is, how does this variation occur? And I refer to it as noise. The ultimate source of it, I think, is hard to tell. You can go down all the way to quantum uncertainty if you want to. That there's really randomness in the universe at some level that manifests at a subatomic scale that then sort of percolates up into the scale of cells and so on. I think even just the way that proteins diffuse inside a cell, the way that genes are expressed, what you can see is that there's some variation. If you track how much of a protein is being made over certain timescales, you'll get little bursts of expression, and then it'll be off in little bursts. So depending on the exact time, you may have more or less of protein molecules, when these, for example, when the two cells are fusing at the midline of the brain to form the bridge for the corpus callosum. So that molecular noise, I think, is the source of some of that variation. Of course, it's a really difficult thing to study because it's so inconsistent. So really, we can infer that it's there from the outcome that it has. It's very difficult to study and measure the processes themselves. The question of whether that's the only thing, the only extra thing that's making twins different from each other, I think it's a major part of it. Because of the fact that there isn't evidence for a shared family environment or other environmental factors influencing those traits. But as I said, there's a relationship between the initial predispositions and the trajectory of our experience throughout our lives. So if that trajectory changes, then obviously that can influence the habitual behaviors that the twins will have. It may not influence their traits so much, but the traits are just the bedrock of what determines how we behave in any given situation.
Hi there, thank you very much. Quick question about the balance between how much is genetic and how much is due to development. So for example, is it possible for somebody who starts off with very little genetic trait of a particular type to then work hard on developing that to get great at something, or is it better off just forgetting that because you've got little chance to start with and going for something that you've already got genetic disposal to?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. It would be nice to think that we could all have, infinite potential in anything that we do, but there are differences between people. I mean, I could train forever. I'd never be as fast as Usain Bolt. I'd never be, have the kinesthetic sense of Lionel Messi. I'd never be Albert Einstein. So, we obviously all can seek to improve, and with training in anything, we get better. And a lot of real, skill really just comes from practice. But I think what tends to happen is that we practice the things that we enjoy, which may be the things that we are, initially good at or interested in anyway, and then that tends to amplify those differences and sort of channel us down a particular route. But that's just a tendency. I think that's just, you look across the population, that's what tends to happen. It's not what has to happen in any individual necessarily.
Thank you.
So I have another question regarding how people could potentially get better at certain things or change characteristics that seem to be genetically determined and developmentally determined. Do you think there's any prospect in the future of significantly altering intelligence, like with genetic engineering or altering genetic expression, with nanotechnology or RNA or brain stimulation, like brainwave stimulation or deep brain stimulation, like with basically high frequency voltage waves or very advanced electrodes or magnetic stimulation or basically like brain nets. I don't know if you heard like what Elon Musk is working on, like with basically the neural net or...
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. We have a super, super good way to increase intelligence, which is education. So
Apart from education.
that's why we educate people, not just so they remember facts, but so they learn how to learn, they learn how to think better, they basically get better at thinking, which is becoming more intelligent, and actually education increases IQ scores throughout the time. So beyond that, there are a number of factors that also influence intelligence that are not genetic, and actually you can see the effects of those across countries or across time. And across time is the most obvious one, because actually IQ tests have been being given for at least a century, and those scores, we've kept track of them in many, many different countries around the world. And what usually happens is that whenever you do IQ tests of a population at a certain time, they normalize the scores to 100. So we have a bell curve. The mean is set as 100 by definition. But actually, if you look at the absolute scores, they've been rising over time, consistently, in every country where they've been looked at, and faster in developing countries than in developed countries. And so the reasons, I think, for that are that we have better nutrition, better infant health, better maternal health, better education, probably more urbanization, more habits of abstract thought that get tested in IQ tests and so on. So all of those things together, if we're thinking in a public health sort of way about intelligence, nutrition and healthcare and education are really the key things that we should be thinking about, in my opinion.
Prospect proven beyond that, because IQ seem to be flatline in a lot of developed countries or first world countries.
Yeah, well, so some of the other technologies that you referred to, there's a trend out there for people to be zapping their brains with things, which, not surprisingly, doesn't help matters much. Actually, there's really no evidence that it improves anything, cognitively speaking, which I don't find surprising. So some of the other aspects are interesting. Could you tweak some molecules, say some of the genes involved in intelligence that we find, and use them as targets for cognitive enhancement? And I think no. And the reason is because they're not genes for intelligence, because you're not thinking with those proteins. Those were involved in making your brain. They might have been active 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And so I think the idea that there's a direct or close relationship between what those molecules do or did and the output of the neural circuits, that turns out just not to be the case, actually. And even at the brain level, intelligence seems to be a property of the whole brain, the efficiency of the entire network. It's not something to do with the metabolic metabolism of some neural circuits or connectivity just here. If you look at what correlates with, it correlates with measures of the entire brain, the way the network is set up. And so I think that means there's not a lot of prospects for sort of invasive interventions in individual people with those kind of technologies that you're talking about that would improve that, because it's such an emergent, holistic property of the way the entire network works that reflects the way that it was formed, and that's what the genes are doing.
What about junk DNA that could potentially influence the expression of many other genes, so kind of like master gene, like master DNA, or non-genetic DNA that could...
Sorry, there was a lot of multiple things in there. So, basically the genetic effects, like I said, are mostly developmental for intelligence, and actually most of the genes that they are finding are neurodevelopmental genes. And so thinking about it in that way, I think, limits the potential for the kinds of interventions that you're talking about.
Hi, I was just wondering, you were talking about early intervention in the developmental stage for things like schizophrenia, autism, or dyslexia. How practical is it, given that there are so many variations in the initial stages and so many influences in the developmental, external influences in the developmental stage? How practical is that sort of likely to come together?
So I should say it's first of all, I'm not an expert in that. But my understanding is certainly that for autism and for dyslexia in particular, that early interventions do make a big difference. For schizophrenia, that's a much different scenario because, first of all, it's not usually an early onset disorder. Usually, it doesn't give rise, doesn't emerge until people are in their late teens or 20s or so on. So it's a little harder to know what an early intervention would look like for that condition, although we may know that someone is at high risk of that, either from genetic screening or from family history and so on. So that's a much trickier kind of thing. And, it may be for some things like that, especially also for things like risk of dementia and so on, knowing that you're at a high genetic risk may allow you at least to modify some lifestyle factors. So for dementia, for example, if you know that you have a family risk of it or a high genetic load, then not smoking is a good idea, not drinking, exercising more is good, and, just having a healthy lifestyle. So there are some sort of lifestyle interventions that we can do. There are some intensive educational interventions that can be undertaken. As I said earlier, they're resource dependent, and my guess is that they'll be more successful for some children than for others.
We have a question a couple of rows back. This gentleman here.
Hi. I just wanted to pick up on something that gentleman over there said. Genes are not the ultimate arbiters of how the intelligence we end up with, as you've made clear. But it did seem that something about plasticity was maybe more related to that overall thing that we call intelligence. So plasticity being the sort of how receptors are stimulated and received. So I just wondered if you see any opportunity, not for high voltage techniques or something, but something that increased the receptiveness, the plasticity of the brain could help augment intelligence in the future.
I mean, it's an interesting idea because you can think of intelligence as behaving intelligently, which requires learning from your experience, what was good, what was bad, and also a higher level kind of thing, which is an ability to make an analogy. So you can say, okay, I was in this situation and I did that and that was bad. And then next time you could be in a slightly different situation, but realize that there was a similarity between those two things. So it's not exactly, it's not a lion this time, it's a leopard, but it looks kind of the same, and it didn't turn out well for me the last time. So there is a higher level ability of that abstract reasoning that may also rely on the synaptic plasticity at some stage. So there have been some experiments in flies and mice where some of the genes that control those plasticity proteins and processes have been tweaked in a way. Now, most of the time when you do that, things get worse. In fact, there's a whole bunch of genetically stupid flies, even stupider than they start out. And the same with mice. It's very easy to mess up the systems and make things worse, but a few very particular kinds of interventions can make things better. Or at least they make the circuits learn in a different way. So for example, in fruit flies, there's some ways you can train them where ordinarily for them to learn a behavior, in this case, they're associating with an odor with a shock. So they smell two different odors. If they go this way, they get that odor. If they get shocked, eventually they learn not to go that way. But it takes about 10 repeated trials of training for them to actually get that. But if you tweak this particular protein, then they get it one time. It's like having a photographic memory. So one example, one event, and they learn not to do that. Now, whether that's a good thing or not is another question. You may think, okay, we've made really smart flies, they learn really quickly, but as I said earlier, you don't want to remember everything. Actually, not everything that happens to you should be remembered like that. There's a reason that the learning curve is calibrated the way that it is. It's evolutionarily adaptive for it to take a few trials sometimes for you to learn something. So I don't know necessarily that even tweaking the plasticity like that to make it more sensitive would necessarily manifest as a person being more intelligent.
Hi, I've become a little bit confused over, earlier you're talking about how the book is called Innate, but then you're talking about how education is the most important factor. So I was wondering, is it that control or influence might be distributed among many factors across different levels? So, for example, I can imagine in some circumstances, looking at your data, maybe we inherit shared environments. So, for example, most of us see pretty much the same things, most of us hear words in our environment. But also, I was just wondering, to what extent can genes themselves be expressed differently depending on the environment they're raised in? I'm not sure if that's...
No, okay, good. So there's a few things wrapped up together there. So the first bit about education is an interesting one. So and about intelligence and so on. So what I showed you, those results of studies that look at the heritability of a trait, they're not discovering some biological truth that holds across the whole world for all time. Okay, they're really saying in the population that we studied, that has this much variation in it, this is the proportion of variation that's attributable to genetic differences. Now that can change, it does change between populations. So if, for example, let's take height as an example, in conditions where there's loads of access to food, everyone has access to lots of protein as they're growing up, you'll get a distribution in height. Most of the differences will be due to genetics. But in conditions where there's unequal access to food, you'll have wider variance in the outcome, and a larger proportion will be due to the environmental differences. So whether or not a trait is heritable in a given population is a very local historical measure. It's not a biological constant like the speed of light. So when I say that genetic differences account for most of the differences in some of these traits in the populations that we've studied, that can be true, and it can be also true that environmental differences can make a difference. And so environmental differences between countries, for example, for intelligence due to nutrition and education and healthcare do make a big difference. So those two things they're not contradictory. I can understand why you would be confused, because it sounds like they are. So, I mean, basically one of them comes down to asking what about the variance, and the other one is what about the mean? And education, for example, can raise the intelligence of everybody. It doesn't mean it's going to erase the differences between people. It's not going to smooth things out necessarily. Some people will benefit more from education than others. So if your goal, if you think the goal of education is to make everybody equally smart, you're going to be disappointed, but it can make everybody smarter. So the differences, the relative differences may remain or even be expanded, but if everybody's increasing, then that's a good thing. What was the second part of the question? Oh, can our genes change in response to our environment? So yes, I mean the answer is yes. Genes go up and turn up or down all the time. That's the way cells respond to their environment. So even in simple cells like bacteria, they're turning on genes, they're turning off genes, depending on what environment they're in. Now for us, our cells, their environment is the other cells of the organism. And what I described during embryogenesis is those cells turning genes on or off based on their environment, if they're at this part of the embryo or that part, and this cell is telling them to do that, and so on. And ultimately, those differences in development can give rise, through very, very indirect steps, to differences in our psychological traits. So, it comes back to the question earlier about whether tweaking some of those genes could affect the traits in an adult person, for example. And generally, for the most part, I think not. I think their effects happened maybe decades earlier. What manifests at the neural circuit level is what's interesting, and it's quite now far removed from the genetic differences that caused it, if that makes sense.
Do you have any feel for the degree of neurological differences that we as individuals acquire through development, how that varies across species? Are we, through our more complex brains, more prone to variation or less prone because of the structures?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. So the developmental program has evolved in such a way to be very robust. And the reason is if it weren't, we just wouldn't survive. So all of those, through evolution, all of those sort of new bits of our brain and so on, that the changes to the developmental program come with some certain degree of robustness baked into them. However, we're a pretty new species, and that development, that evolution happened very quickly. And because of the way that our species evolved into this cognitive niche that we have made for ourselves, that there was a rapid sort of snowballing, I think, of the value of a bigger brain and greater intelligence and so on within humans, generally speaking. So I think it may be the case, and this is speculative, that actually our brains are like, you know, we've sort of constantly upgraded our operating system. We're always getting the new iPhone, you know, before the bugs have all been tested out of it. So we're all beta testing our own brains and genomes all the time. So what that may mean is that actually the evolutionary cost of having a really complicated human brain is that actually it's prone, it's fragile and sensitive to certain types of mutations, and the outcome of that may be things like schizophrenia and autism and epilepsy. So the complexity of the system may bring along certain unanticipated failure modes that evolution can't anticipate, so it can't avoid them. I mean, what happens is that the people with those conditions may have fewer offspring, and so the particular mutations that arise may get weeded out, but they recur in the population, and then we're left with a certain sort of level of mental illness. It's possible that that's the cost of our incredibly complex brain and the rapidity with which evolution got us to that point. But that's, I mean, it's quite speculative because nobody goes out and surveys, you know, species in the wild to see if the chimps or the tigers or the aardvarks have schizophrenia or not. So we don't really know the answer to how fragile their brains are.
Thank you. And a question in the front row here.
I also wanted to ask a question about the future, because the more we understand how things work, everybody starts wanting to change how things work. And obviously right now it's not possible, but things that are possible right now also were impossible a long time ago. In your experience in the field and what people are doing, how fast do you think? I mean, are we the only people who want to change something in our brains, or are people also working on trying to fix, and maybe not create superhumans, but maybe start fixing some things that are possibly negatively affecting people's life? And is it going to be a few generations, or?
So, I mean, there's a few aspects to that. So, I think, you know, if we think in medical terms, for example, I think the biggest implications of the kind of work that I've been talking about, and I didn't really give details of the work that has led to the identification of specific genetic variants that predispose to conditions of mental illness or epilepsy or neurological conditions. But they've happened very rapidly, and they're continuing to happen very rapidly. So the first effect of that, I think, will be an enhanced ability for pre-implantation screening or genetic selection, as I mentioned earlier. There's some talk about, you know, using new techniques like this genome editing technique to go into embryos and actually repair a gene, and people are doing that for some kinds of conditions, not necessarily in embryos, but in, you know, in skin conditions and so on. You can go into the skin cells and repair a faulty gene. So that's amazing stuff. For neurological conditions, it's a lot harder to see doing that kind of thing. It's technically just difficult to get this stuff into your brain, and it would be a lot more complicated to do that. So, but I think what may happen when we when we discover the genetic variants, say, that predispose to a condition like autism. So some people think, okay, I found a gene that causes autism, therefore I can make a drug that binds that protein and it will, you know, fix the symptoms of autism over here. And I think that's really not likely to happen, because it's this developmental trajectory. So what I think may happen, and this is something that we worked on in my own lab, is to try and make animal models, for example, that have that same mutation. So mice have the same genes that we have. If we find a mutation in a human, you can make that same mutation in a mouse, and then you can learn something about the neurobiology. You can do experiments in an animal that you can't do in a human, so you can see, okay, this is why this is how the brain is developing in a different way. This circuit is slightly off, or so on. And then there may be an insight that says, actually, I can understand that symptom of, say, anxiety in people with autism, maybe due to this circuit, and I know there's an ion channel there or a neurotransmitter receptor that I can tweak with this drug to counterbalance that. So for me, that's the trajectory that will likely produce some impact for mental illness. but it's a really, really long process. So that's a 30-year time horizon, not a 5-year time horizon, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got time for one more question. Is there anyone left in the gallery that wants to ask a question?
Thank you very much. Can I indulge myself and have two for the price of one, if the first one's quick?
Okay.
The first one is 23andMe, is it worth the price? And the second question is, to what extent do you think that neural spiking can have a positive role in computing?
In computing?
Yes.
Great questions. Okay, so 23andMe is one of these direct-to-consumer genomics companies. You guys have probably all heard about it. Ancestry.com is another one. You can give them some, saliva sample, and they will look at markers across the genome. And the first thing that those markers will tell you is your ethnicity, your ancestry, basically. So, and it does that pretty well. If you want to know that, and maybe you don't know it already, that can be informative. It's kind of fun, sort of genealogical sort of thing. 23andMe used to give health information. So there are some of those profiles of common differences in the population that are statistically associated with a very, very slight increased risk for, say, Alzheimer's disease or prostate cancer or something like that. They were stopped from giving that information for a while because it wasn't an FDA-approved test. I think they're allowed to give it again. I think that information is practically useless, actually, because it's derived from these massive population studies. And you say, okay, it's a small percentage of the risk for any of those conditions that they're actually looking at, and it gives it just a very sort of statistical measure for an individual, but they don't know the accuracy of that measure. So if they say your risk of Alzheimer's is 23%, well, what's the window of confidence that they have in assigning it to an individual? It actually doesn't apply to an individual, really. It applies at a population level. And so I think there's a bit of snake oil there in terms of the usefulness of those predictions. And as it happens, the advice is always the same. Exercise, sleep better, don't smoke, don't drink. You can just do all of those things anyway and save the money. Now, the other question is really interesting. So when we're thinking about learning about how the brain works, and I didn't talk about it much, but of course there's loads of stuff happening in artificial intelligence and so on. And what we've seen over recent years is an incredible ramping up of the power of things like machine learning and deep learning. And really, they're sort of like statistics on steroids. They really just take in masses and masses and masses of information and use almost brute force and ignorance to recognize patterns in the data. They're exceptionally good at some things, and they're really, really stupid otherwise for things that toddlers find easy to do. So I think, actually, that understanding the way that brain circuits are wired and the development of real, what they call neuromorphic computing that's actually patterned on the brain, will be really beneficial. As it happens, artificial intelligence and neuroscience diverged like 30 years ago. They're starting to talk to each other again a little bit, which I think is really exciting. But we'll see how that goes. I think there's a lot of potential there, but it requires people to cross the divide, and it's still actually quite wide at the moment.
Okay, so thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming tonight.
Thank you.